Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So let me tell you about Portland, Oregon, and eventually why I've got Darth Vader playing flaming bagpipes on a unicycle next to John the Baptist. I've wanted to go to Portland for a while now. Portland, to me, to people my age, is what San Francisco in the 60s was to baby boomers. That's probably a good comparison. So when we drove from Vancouver to San Francisco last year, imagine that, we made a point to stop. And the thing about Portland is that until the 60s, it was a horrible place to live. It is in the middle of rainy nowhere, and because of the traditional lumber and shipbuilding industry, the population was overwhelmingly single men until the Second World War. I think something like half the residences prior to the war were rooming houses. During the war, black families flocked to Portland because there was good shipbuilding jobs to be had. And you know what? They flocked right back out as soon as the war was finished. They did not stay. And so that should paint a pretty clear picture of how terrible Portland was as a place to live. But come the 60s, the hippies were moving west, and often they were heading to San Francisco, but many of them saw Portland as a blank slate. Here was a relatively large city that absolutely no one cared about. So there was this vast hippie invasion into Portland, and it's never been the same since. And so today, Portland's motto is Keep Portland Weird. And given the history, you might be able to imagine why. Creative city planning became a major thrust in Portland. Early on, they were extremely intentional about green space and urban sprawl without overcrowding the city. And to be honest, I've never been anywhere like it. They balance that extremely well. Their transit system is amazing. It's multimodal to the nth degree. There's streetcars, buses, light rail. I think they've even got a cable car that goes up the side of a mountain because they're in the edge of the Rockies. They have a very creative and progressive approach to homelessness. There's a lot of homelessness out west, and that was very apparent that they were being creative about that. And the culture is something else. Mr. Unipiper up here is not an uncommon sight. In fact, we were only there for 2 days, but Grace and I sat in the window of a restaurant, and there were just people wandering around, going about their daily business in full costume. Have you ever seen anything like that? We thought maybe there was a party nearby, but it turned out that's just how Portland is. If you feel like going to your errands dressed as Winnie the Pooh, you can do that, and nobody's going to turn their nose up at it. Also, I saw the most number and the most comfortable LGBTQ couples I have ever seen in one place. In Portland, you can be you, no matter who that is. Now, enough about Portland. Let's switch gears to John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a weirdo, and that's kind of the idea. He ate weird food, he wore weird clothes, he lived in a weird place, and he led a weird group of people. In fact, Jesus was pretty normal, especially by comparison. He did the things that normal people did. He was supposed to be approachable. John very much did not. He really was a voice crying out in the wilderness. He was an outlier. And that makes a lot of sense to me because have you ever heard the term early adopter tax? Elizabeth has. Anybody else? Basically, when someone does something new, they have to pay the price for doing something new. Think about, as a metaphor, the first one to scout a trail in the woods. You've got some property and you want to put a trail out. Imagine being the first person, and I imagine a few of you have done this. The first person has to find the course, has to bushwhack their way through thick brush, and then tie up the ribbon markers. And it's an awful lot more work than the subsequent people through, right? Maybe the second person comes through, clears some brush, and by the time the majority of people are walking through this trail, it's been well worn and established, the brush has been cleared, it's easy going. The first people to go down that trail have to expend an awful lot more energy than the majority that come down the line. Often they may even get called crazy or get hurt. That's the early adopter tax. So for example, think about all the ships that tried to find the Northwest Passage and never came back. That's the early adopter tax. They paid the price. John the Baptist himself was beheaded for being who he was. My point is that it's very difficult to do something new. And in fact, the first person to do something new is very likely going to get hurt, if not just ostracized. It might not work until the second or third or fourth or fifth person through. And until this new thing becomes mainstream, all those early adopters are going to be a minority bucking the trend. They're going to be considered weird. And I kind of think Jesus needed someone to go down the path first. Someone to prime the pump or warm up the crowd. By the time Jesus came, John had already started something new. And by comparison, Jesus was considerably more approachable than John. The real gospel ministry could now start. John created the environment where Jesus and the people could be different, where they could be weird. Now, I'm going to tell you about the only disappointment we had in Portland. A few years ago, the moderator of General Assembly here at the Presbyterian Church in Canada was holding up First Presbyterian Portland as a model for the rest of us. He'd been there and he said that Portland was this weird and eclectic community, and here was this church that had intentionally leaned into that culture. I've got to see this, I thought. And what we found wasn't necessarily a bad church, but it certainly wasn't what we were promised. In fact, they were doing interesting things, but it was a straight-laced downtown church. Pretty counter to the vibrant and bizarre culture around it. In fact, we happened to be there on the day that one of the ministers was preaching her last sermon. She was leaving, and it was a scathing message about how resistant that congregation had been to change. It was quite the day to show up, and I'm sure they probably weren't happy to have visitors that day. Portland, definitely an acquired taste. But here was a whole city who was prepared to do things differently, and it's become a test bed for trying things. It could be argued that to be countercultural in such a weird place is to be normal, whatever normal means. But it was pretty neat to see a place where anyone could be who they wanted to be and be whoever they were. People who would struggle elsewhere. And I thought it was jarring to see such a strong church be the holdout. So, I kind of think we're called to be more like John than Jesus. Jesus himself did not make change. He showed us how to make change in a pretty dramatic way. And I think the reason for that was that forcing a perfect world on us is going to make it seem a lot less perfect. We need to be the ones to choose that perfect world for it to be perfect. So today, we are the keepers of that story. We're also the people, or being the keepers rather, we're also the people creating an environment where others can hear the story that Jesus told. Jesus is the story. We are the ones making the paths straight to that story. And if that's the case, then we really can't be afraid to be like John, to be weird. We should embrace being weird, because unless we're weird, we're probably not doing our job. We're probably not trying things differently or experimenting enough. But do we? Are we the ones comfortable with being trailblazers and doing things differently? Or are we the ones most often looking around us for what we should do? Amen.